I want to talk about tracked properties.
I saw that.
Because it's top of mind. We were just talking about them with Tom at the meetup. And yeah, he was showing them off. I also just watched Tom's EmberFest keynote.
Oh, nice.
Which is pretty cool. He goes over Glimmer components and shows all the new APIs that are, the goal is to have them ready for Octane in March at EmberConf.
Can you quickly explain the difference between angle brackets and Glimmer components?
Good question. I don't know if I can, but I think today if you install a new app and you use angle brackets to invoke, you're still getting an Ember component. I really don't know. I'd have to check.
I think that's right. I think the angle brackets transpile.
Yeah.
To
curlies.
To curlies.
So you still have a root. Yeah, it's true because you still have a root div with an Ember ID. Whereas like if you watch Tom's thing, there's no root div. There's no Ember ID.
I didn't know that. Interesting. Okay.
Pretty cool.
And so also tracked is something that's part of the Glimmer component, not part of angle brackets?
Right now, correct. There's an RFC for adding tracked properties to Ember, I believe. So I think the angle brackets, the @args, splattributes, tracked are ways of incrementally bringing the Glimmer component model into Ember.
Cool.
Which is pretty cool. They're doing it like that. Because we're using angle brackets in some of our demos and code bases and stuff, even though we're not using Glimmer. I mean, I've never used Glimmer before, really.
Yeah, I know Robert made this. It's like Sparkle components, and it's something that uses a component manager, which is an interface in Ember that lets you define your own components. I think for this very reason, so they could slowly start to introduce these Glimmer components or these Glimmer style components without, a massive refactor.
Right.
So
don't mind me. I'm just making my tea over here.
Nice.
Tea is growing on me. I'm a real big coffee guy, but once you have your third or fourth cup of coffee by the day, by 3:00, it loses a little bit of its. I wake up so excited for my first cup of coffee. I sometimes go to bed dreaming about waking up for my first cup of coffee. But your body it hits a saturation point. You don't care about this at all.
This is like the worst pitch for tea ever.
Yeah, tea.
Tea when you're burnt out on coffee.
Yeah, exactly. Tea, the crappy alternative when you can't handle any more coffee. So, rationalizing the primitives, component managers, all that stuff. So what I was bike shedding or wanting to bike shed over, and I have to admit, I'm a bad community member when it comes to reading RFCs and keeping up to date with this stuff. I don't honestly understand how people do it because for me, it just takes me a long time. Maybe I'm dumb. I don't know. But when I read through this stuff and all the threads that are going on and people talking about all the hypotheticals and the branching and stuff, and you open this GitHub issue and it's just crazy. Also, the RFC changes. So it's just, personally, I actually subscribe to the RFC's repo, which has been a good way for me to know when a new RFC opens up because I get a notification in my email. But then I end up muting 8/10 of them, let's say 80% of them, because they're just things that I trust people and I don't really think I'm going to have something useful to say. But then sometimes, like for big ones, I'll want to read it and comment or whatever.
By the way, I do that as well. And I think that's one of the best ways to stay up to date with Ember.
RFC's repo.
Yeah. You just get email notifications. I mute 90, I probably mute 100%, but at least I know oh yeah, there's an RFC for that if I ever need to go back.
What about your own RFCs?
My own RFCs?
Do you mute them?
Those instant mute.
Archive rule to go directly to the trash.
Yeah.
So we were talking about this at the Ember meetup last week, and the track property stuff obviously is like one of the biggest changes to the programming model. It's one of the biggest changes to the programming model because today you create a new component, and let's say you say name : null because it's that's your way of saying that there's a property, and then maybe on did receive adders or something or whatever, you can just say this dot set name Sam, and this dot set is an Ember API that tells the rest of the framework it's time to update this thing. But from your perspective as a programmer, that's how you update things. That's how you push updates. And so the switch with tracked is I'm almost thinking about this now after having discussed this a little bit in Discord today. You flip it. So instead of having an API for setting and then not having to do anything special to the properties, we actually decorate the properties that are going to change, and then we don't have to do anything special on the set. So we don't have to call this .set anymore. Once you mark it, once you decorate it, you don't have to call this .set. You just get to update it as you would any JavaScript object.
Yeah. So would you say it's like it goes from like a push model to where like you're pushing things out with set to like a pull model where you mark something with tracked, and then when that thing changes, you're basically going to know it changes and you need to update your template?
I guess there's two questions here, which is like, one, what's the programming model for the programmer? Like, how do I think about this? And like, why am I using this .set here versus why am I just using this .foo equals bar here? So there is some leakage there in the sense that like, yeah, I have two ways to update data. And when I do this .set, it's because it's an Ember property and I know it needs to interact with other Ember objects in the system and maybe eventually make its way into a template. Whether the Ember engine and Ember internals are pulling or like pushing, I think it's like, you don't really think about that as a programmer. And then the tracked thing is like, same kind of thing where you can just use, vanilla JS, but then once this thing is going to be needing to affect changes elsewhere, or maybe possibly have a side effect in my template and cause it to re-render, then I need to mark it as tracked. So I'm interested in this because, again, I just don't know a lot of the internals. I haven't worked on this stuff, but like when I first heard about tracked, I was kind of like, it seems a little strange, the wording. It seems like computed makes sense. Like you're writing a computed property and it has dependent keys. All that's from the perspective of the programmer. And I'm writing something that depends on these things. That all makes sense. I understand why tracked exists, and I think it's a good improvement in a lot of ways. Tracked gets rid of the need to specify dependent keys on computed properties. You just have to mark it as tracked, and Ember is able to find out what the dependent keys are for you, which is awesome. And we don't have to call this .set anymore. So it's an improvement to the programming model for sure. My question is, what the name tracked to me seems like it's, and I want to read through the entire RFC, all the back and forth, so I really understand, because I really don't want to say something in the RFC comments before reading everything, because I'm sure there was lots of bike shedding over the names. But it seems like the word tracked is really spilling out the implementation details as opposed to being focused on the programmer model, because it's really saying that this is a property that the Ember templating layer needs to track in order to re-render.
So you would want something like at this thing changes, at changes, at mutable.
So the question is like, why? So the question is like, as a programmer, I create a new object or a component, and it's pretty cool. These things work on objects too. So you have like an ES6 class called person that doesn't extend anything, and you can add tracked to it.
That's awesome.
It's really awesome. So it's like, instead of having to extend ember.object, you just can create ES classes and decorate properties with tracked, which is awesome. Like you don't have to extend, you don't have like single inheritance. You can just, it's like almost like including a module in Ruby, right? So again, the question is like, I'm working on this thing. I have these properties, I'm typing, I look at my template. It works the first time. Then I add a little button that changes counter, and it changes counter, and I look at my template and it's not working. It's like, oh wait, why not? What do I need to do here? And then the answer is you have to add tracked. But again, that's like, as a programmer, I'm not saying that this thing is, it's like,
you're not saying you're tracking this thing.
Exactly.
With computed, you're saying like, I'm computing this thing.
And it depends on these other things of mine. Whereas this is like, oh, right, Ember needs to know about this, so I'm going to say it's tracked. So I also grabbed these two quotes. Go ahead.
I was thinking, like, I know this word has baggage, but like, it's almost like observable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I want to make this thing observable in the rest of my system.
Well, what you're really saying, well, here, let me read these. So this is from Tom's EmberCamp talk. When he's introducing this, he says, so here he's kind of going over this full name, first name, last name, or we have a first name thing. And then it says, here we use the track decorator to tell Ember that we're expecting this first name property might change. So notice that he didn't, if you were describing this to someone, you wouldn't say, now we're going to use a track property because we're tracking it. Yeah. We're not tracking it. Ember is tracking it.
At maybe changes.
At maybe changes, really. Then we have this other one from the RFC, which was a comment. I think it was Tom as well. He said, in general, the idea is that mutable properties should be marked as tracked and immutable properties should not.
So I have a feeling you're about to say we should have @mutable and @immutable.
I haven't thought about this yet enough to know and use my thesaurus enough. I don't think we need @immutable because it's a default.
Okay, but
@mutable. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying this thing is like a volatile, mutable property. It changes over time. That's the whole point of like the state over time thing. That's the whole point of like why we even need to think about this in Ember versus why we don't think about this in something like Rails.
Right. I'm having a bad reaction to that word because there's so many things in JavaScript that are mutable, and just because you don't like the variable is mutable even without this @mutable.
Right. JavaScript objects have already a notion of like being frozen and not when you object.freeze an object, you're making it not. There's a property called shoot. I was just using this. You have like properties are like enumerable and I can't remember, but it's basically this idea.
Is it like a symbol on the object that doesn't?
It's like, you know how you like do for of and a key is an object, and it's like if they're enumerable, it does it. But
it's
you
like
can
an iterator.
You can like define a property. You can like object.define property, Sam, first name, and then you can make it like not enumerable, and you can make it not something that makes it not able to be changed.
I see.
Anyway, so there is definitely a notion of mutability already. And of course, if you had an object that wasn't being tracked, you could change it. And so in that sense, it's mutable. It's not immutable in the sense of a true immutable like library or language. But it is true. Yeah. What are you saying? You're saying that this thing is going to change over time.
It like propagates throughout the system.
Yeah. It's like maybe
we need a thesaurus.
Yeah.
And a room for storing bikes.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So that's what I have that on my to-do list to pop up on Thursday or Friday once I finish my work for the week. And I want to read through that and look at the thesaurus because I think it's important because it does. Tom is going through, it does a great job in the talk of saying like the dependent keys in a computed property are a concession that we had to make. He doesn't say this is my words, but it's true. It's a concession we had to make as part of the API design. It was a trade-off, but it was worth it, right? We opted into that design to make it so that computed properties were fast. They could be a core part of the programming model, but the fact that you have to specify the dependent keys twice, and Tom says this in talk, he's like, this is not helping the expressiveness of this code. This is just you telling Ember enough to know for it to do its job. But what if it could do it automatically here? And then he goes into the track stuff. And the track stuff is definitely an improvement, but it also needs to be framed in that way where it's like, I'm marking this as something that can change over time. And yes, Ember uses that, but it's also, like can be expressed in a way that makes the code clear. And I think tracked is confusing. Tracked is like, oh, the template needs to track this, as opposed to like what I'm actually saying, which is I'm declaring that this thing can change over time.
Now is the best time to do this because this is, from the looks of it, this is an API that's going to live for a very long time.
Yes.
So yes. It's going to be a lot easier to get it right now than next year.
Right. Exactly. So I definitely want to do that. But yeah, that's just something I wanted to chat about because it was kind of top of mind, and curious to hear other people's thoughts about that too. You were going to make a video on 404 pages.
Yeah.
How'd that go?
Swing and a miss.
I've been there.
We have. I kind of realized why this was so hard. So I was doing some debugging on the site last week, and we have a 404 route at the very bottom of our route definitions. And so the idea here is like
a catch-all.
Yeah, it's a catch-all. So the route, when Ember starts, recognizing URL, it's just going to go through all those routes in order, and it's going to grab the first one that matches. And if you get to the very bottom of our router and nothing's been matched, we have this thing that's like this.route 404, and it has a wildcard URL, so it literally catches anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that works great when the route can't be recognized. So if you go to like embermap.com/ASDF, then you get the 404, the catch-all catches it. I noticed that there's routes that can be recognized, but they still 404. So an example is like we have our video pages. You go to like embermap.com, topics, some topic / this video doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And
so it's like a slug. We're using an identifier, or it could be a number, let's say. But yeah.
But the route recognizer can recognize this. Mm-hmm. So we'll load that route. And then you're in a situation here where it's like, I need a way to fetch some data or load some data from the local store and say that like, hey, I don't have data. This thing is null. Send me to a 404 page. So like my first attempt was to use transition to. It's just kind of like how we change the route with Ember. There's like a problem here where that changes the URL as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you end up going to a video that can't be found, but then the URL changes to like /404.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the best UX. You want the original URL to stay.
Also, if you were to fast boot this page,
You get a redirect, yeah.
and you want the client to know that this route they visited is a 404. It doesn't exist on the site.
Yep. So I found this API intermediate transition to,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a way how like Ember renders its loading templates and its error templates. So this is a way you can render a new template without updating the URL. That's like the whole point of this API.
And it's public API.
Public API, but it's different than the other router transition methods in that it's synchronous. So if you try to run it in a like after model or redirect hook, it does the redirect, but it's because it's synchronous and your route has like no async code, Ember still tries to render your original template. And therefore you're like rendering your template with a null model. So you get some errors, just hilarity ensues and you get a bunch of errors. So I was like digging around the code and I figured like, okay, so like Ember will block routing when one of the hooks returns a promise. So if I return a promise and then inside that promise I do this intermediate transition to,
and then resolve,
I don't even have to resolve because intermediate transition to updates the router and you're just in this new route state and the old route state's ignored. But because it returned a promise, you don't start rendering the template, the original URL template that like couldn't be found. So this works, but this is like, I was uncomfortable with making a video. It felt like hacky.
and it's like the dangling promise never gets resolved ever.
You could,
Whether you were to click a link back home or something,
whether you resolve the promise or not doesn't matter.
Okay.
Because you're in a route and then you transition to another route. So Ember just has completely
by the
moved
time
away
it
from that
renders
route.
the not found template, that thing is gone.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but it felt hacky.
Yeah.
I couldn't. I'm like explaining this now, but I'd love for someone to be like, yes, that's correct, or no, that's wrong.
Right.
Like it's very hard to follow the source code and figure out like this is exactly why this thing is happening.
Right.
Also, just returning like an empty promise that never resolves is just it's like a gotcha.
Yeah.
And then I figured too, there's even like another state here. So I'm talking about like you have a route and you know that you can't find a model to render this. So it's like very clear. Like I don't have a model. When I like poke in my local data store, I can't find anything that I can use on this route. There's also another state where I fetch something from my backend and the backend 404s, which causes Ember data to throw an exception. So this is not, I don't have a model. This is my route through an exception.
Wait, I don't have a model?
I don't have a model is like, say you store all your data locally.
Yeah.
So there's no data fetching.
I see. You're just saying the not found is dependent on the AJAX request, where sometimes it might not be.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you store your data locally, you can like look for it and you get back nothing, get back an empty array
you
or
need
null.
to be able to transition the thing into a not found state.
Right. But then also there's like this other layer that's what do we do if your model hook throws an exception because Ember data encountered a 404.
Right.
And now it's you can't do like if 404 in the route hook, like the route threw an exception. So now you go into like this error substate. So there's all these like 404 is a lot different than your
one wildcard thing.
Yeah, or like your server rendered application where it's just like, hey, I don't know how to handle this request.
Yeah.
There's like all these different ways a 404 can happen.
I was trying to remember, did I read this because we were talking about this or a tweet or something where someone was like, oh, we're still trying to, like, why are we still trying to use these concepts from like server rendered request response things like 404s when we are on like a client? It might have been in response to one of your discourse posts, but it's like we're in a client app and like if you click a button in at 404s, you don't need to transition to a 404 route and render not found. Like you have more insight into what's happening, and so you can just handle it right there or something like that. Did we talk about that?
I don't think so.
Okay,
This might
I
be
don't
from
remember, but
I don't know. Like, no, we should still honor HTTP. If the browser makes a request to /videos/ this video doesn't exist, you
right, you could show a modal window or something that's like you're trying to access something that doesn't exist, like in the context of the video page, but
it's still 404. Like, you still want to.
Right.
There's tons of infrastructure built up around
the assumptions of HTTP.
Yeah. So to just throw that all away and say, you know, I think it's different too once the app is already loaded. Yeah, you do have client-side state, you know. Yeah, status codes, there's so much like hidden layers on the web with like
the fast boot stuff too.
And
also,
yes, server-side rendering.
Like as soon as you fast boot and you don't honor those, then you're in a weird spot.
Yeah. So this I kind of like, I'm going to merge the code into EmberMap.
Because it improves EmberMap.
Yeah, it improves EmberMap. That does the promise with the intermediate transition to. It works. And from when I kind of follow the code through the router, it makes sense. But it's just, I'm just not, number one, not comfortable making a video. But number two, just like, wow, this is way harder.
Yeah.
This is way, there's like 3 ways in a client-side app in 404.
Yeah. This also led us to discuss, we happened to pull up Laravel's website and just to see what their API is. And we found like a whole dedicated page for handling 404s.
Yeah, there was like a part of their guides. There was like, this is how you do not founds. There's an API for it. It's very clear. Like you make a not found template. You know, something ends up not being found. That thing gets rendered.
Right.
So it was very. What I'm battling is like, let me think about all the ways that my app can 404, and then how to, based on what state I'm in, how to transition to those states. Where Laravel is more like, no, you encounter 404, we'll take care of that for you.
They have the higher level API.
Yeah.
And Rails has something similar, I think.
Yeah, with Rails, I was like looking at some old Rails apps. Like there's 2 strategies. One is you have like Nginx. Say like a lot of folks, I don't know if this is so popular now, but back in the day would put Nginx in front of Rails. And if Rails ever responded with like a 404, Nginx would intercept that and then render like your error template that's checked into your Rails.
So even
app.
if you went to a route that was recognized by Rails, if it then does like a user.find 100 and it doesn't exist, it'll 404. And
it'll
then
404. Yeah, because like Rails could throw like a not found exception. You can like catch that and say render 404, and then that starts going out. Nginx is in front, it grabs that and like renders a 404 template. Also, too, Rails makes it easy to render 404 templates. You can do
like in the middle of some control flow.
Yeah, exactly. You can do render, error templates /404 and status not found. So yeah, this is, yes, I think that Rails, I think the Laravel one was like the nicest. Like, like, wow, they're really thinking of me.
Right.
Rails was not at that level, but it was still like, yeah, this is something I can solve. And then the client-side app, the Ember version, was just like,
you're on your own.
Yeah, there's a lot. Too much here from like, thinking about all the states you can be in that can cause a 404.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting to just look at those because I think there is this class of concerns that app developers deal with every day that is a layer above, stuff like the programming model, stuff like computer properties and tracked, like form validations is another thing that comes to mind.
These are like, that's easy, just do this type problems. But the reality is like, these are problems that everyone faces, and they're hard to solve on your own. They often get overlooked.
And you just don't want to have to solve. That's part of why you use an opinionated framework like Ember.
Yes.
You just want to see a 404 page in the guides.
I was thinking like, it's like, could we make an add-on? Like, what if could we make an add-on that just patched a bunch of Ember internals to make this thing doable? Like it opened up the route file. You can just import
a function that says like, like you said, render 404.
Render 404. Like opened up the route file, it added that catch-all to the very bottom of the file. So you never have to deal with that.
Right.
It gives you all your routes a method that's like this dot show 404.
Right.
It does things like set the
Status on fast boot.
Yeah. Status code on fast boot. So
Mhm.
you actually get a proper 404.
Yep. Cool.
Just those ergonomic things. I like when I was poking around at this, I felt like, man, I'm like going to be like monkey patching a lot of stuff, and it felt kind of uncomfortable. So I was like, yeah, I think at this layer, just like expose all these
The ways.
weird API ways we're doing it right now.
And just get consensus around how people are doing this.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
Because both transition to and replace with were not the right solution.
Well, they update the URL.
Right.
So
and then intermediate transition to is like something no one, I mean, when's the last time you've heard someone using that?
yeah. Yes. I mean, yeah, that doesn't show up.
Is it even in the guides? I mean,
yeah,
it's in the API
no,
docs.
it's not. It's in, I think it might be in the guides. It's in the API docs. It's public API. I mean, it doesn't explain it in the context of a 404, but explains it in the context of a loading state. And then you can kind of use your imagination and be like, oh yeah, when I render a loading template, my URL doesn't change to like /post/loading and then back to /post.
Right.
So there is, Ember
Right.
has some mechanism for rendering a new.
Different templates on the same URL.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's intermediate transition too.
Yeah. Oh, there's a support doggy. We should get a dog for the office.
Support dog.
Yeah.
So I can cry about 404s to my support dog.
Yeah. Try to make a video. It doesn't work out. And you just hold the dog and just pet it. And you just post a video on EmberMap that's like 10 minutes of me just like crying into a dog and petting it.
Yeah. And our all of a sudden our views like quadruple.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, we're a data-driven firm, you know. These things really help us out. So that's interesting. I'd like to hear some resolve about that. Something else we wanted to talk about. We have our email course that we put out, and started getting some feedback about that. And we had a good conversation in the EmberMap Slack with CodeIgniter.
Frank.
Yeah, Frank.
Yep.
And it was about our like smart components lesson, where you render a tweet card and you do @tweet equals tweet. And it's like, we've talked about this in a bunch of our videos and blog posts and stuff. Sometimes when you have too many component arguments, it's because it shouldn't be a dumb component. It should be a smart component, and it's like domain specific.
We have a series, our component side effects series.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And it was interesting because I think he's just lived by the constraint that routes do like the data mutation. And if like a route model hook fetches data, it owns the data. And so all the actions that mutate the data live at that route. And he's just like given that as a hard constraint for all of his Ember apps. And he was talking about liking that. And he was kind of like, devil's advocate against what we were saying, which is like making a user form or a tweet card smart.
Also in like the early days of Ember, it was easier to put all your actions on the controller on the route. And because there was no like there was a view hierarchy, but I don't think I really ever thought of it. It just things would directly have access to the controller. So if like you had a view and that rendered a view and that rendered a view, they would all share the same controller property.
Right. The context of this context was implicit and it was all the controller.
So you could easily get from third view up to the controller.
Right.
And so there was like this nice pattern of you render a template, you have an action, that action calls something on the controller, that controller like does some mutation on the model, and that model flows back down to the template. So you can imagine like this giant data mutation responsive circle.
Right.
But now that we have components, you lose that context. So it's a lot harder when you're 3 components in.
Prop drilling, basically. Yeah. I think one way to think about this problem is you start out with an app. You have the home controller, the home template, the home route. The route fetches the data, controller maybe adds a computed property, and then the template starts, renders it out. And then you add stuff to the template over time, maybe an action or two on the controller. That's what we would do. Like if you press something, you would just use the controller and make an action to it. And especially if it was client side and it didn't change the URL, it didn't refresh the model or anything like that. Now your template is no longer 30 lines. It is, 300 lines, 200 lines. And so you want a mechanism to break up that template. Like it gets big and you just want to break it up. And like you said, we used to have views, which is like I have this code and I'm just drawing this box around it and putting it into a new file because it's just helping me to organize this. But fundamentally, there's nothing changing by the architecture. Like the data is still flowing down and they're doing an action, right? And when we have components and now you have to pass everything explicitly, it feels like a bigger step because you draw a box around this and you want to like extract it, but now you have a new contract. You have to define a contract for that component. One of the things we've seen people get into trouble with is, especially when components first came around, was like, components are isolated and made for reusable widgets. But you're not drawing this box around the part of your home template to make it reusable. You're literally just doing it because your template is like 250 lines of code.
Yeah, and this is less true with things that are like color pickers and date pickers that are reusable. But there's definitely a whole class of components. It's like my widget editing component and my widget viewer component. Like those things are made for your application.
Right.
They're not made to be shared.
Right.
Like date picker is made to be shared.
Right. And you would make date picker or color picker after having seen the same code in 3 times and say, I'm going to put this in a component. But the thing I'm describing, which is just like, this is a complex route and I just need help. I need to make this a little more sane to work with. That's all it is.
Mm-hmm.
You're not saying I need to reuse this and I see duplications, nothing with that. But you use components to break it up because that's a primitive that we have.
So why not just why not use like partials to break it up?
Yeah, or views, right? I mean, so this is like, you could imagine views still being around in the framework because they fill this role. And now you have a very clear thing like, is this reusable? It's a component, and you have to define an interface now. Whereas view is basically a partial, and it inherits its interface's boundary from its context. The problem with views back in the day when we used them was just that it was confusing because you now have a view 3 or 4 or 5 layers down, and it's doing like this dot first name, and you're like, what is this again? And you have to look at everything. So today we will use components. There are no more views basically, and we use components. And even though you have to redefine that interface, like my model hook already said I return a user, and now I'm passing it into a component that takes a user and another component that takes a user. But that's the explicitness is worth it because now I can just, if I'm working on, maybe there's all the CRUD parts of this in this route and I'm just working on the new, I just know that my component takes a user. And so if I need to do something, it has a user. So that's fine.
Yeah. And your component has its own little sandbox. So your component takes some stuff and it's not going to all of a sudden start mutating data on another component.
Right. So that's part of this, which is that just because we're using components which have the ability to be reusable, it doesn't mean that they necessarily are. And so we call these things structural components because, again, if you could imagine taking all those components and just inlining them and putting them at the route level template, and that's all you're doing. You're just doing that to make it easier to work with. So in the same spirit of that, if you are creating a structural component by taking part of that out and pulling it into a component, why not bring along the action with it, right? Because we're really just saying that this is to make it easier to work with. And so if you're going to separate this both by area in the template, which is probably logically related, let's bring along like the modal that shows up when you click the button, or the form that gets submitted, and the actions that do that stuff. And with dependency injection, now, the route returns the model and that gets injected, it gets set on the controller. But if you want to draw a box, you can just say, oh yeah, we need the user as well. And so we're just going to inject the store and get it or something like that. And then you can not worry about passing things down all the time. And it makes it a lot easier to work with.
Yeah.
So
I think another way to like frame this argument is if you're building a new component, like you would obviously bring the template along with that new component. You'd bring like the styles along with that new component. So why not bring the actions along?
Right.
Why not bring the data along?
Right. And one of the arguments, what Frank was talking about, and what we've seen plenty of other folks talk about too, is like, who is the data owner? So the argument here is like the route is defining what data is being fetched and what is being set on the controller and presented. So it owns the data. And so now you have components that are children that are mutating that data out kind of from underneath its feet. And that leads to potentially confusing code. So what we found is that the way we think about this is while the route is specifying what data needs to be fetched in order to render the template, it's really more like sending a message to the store. And because we use Ember data and that data gets fetched from the server and loaded into the store lives outside of the UI hierarchy. It's kind of over here. And then you have like your active view hierarchy over here. But the store is over here. And as the user moves through the app, populates data into that store, that data doesn't go anywhere unless you unload it. But basically, it's separate. It lives separately. It's an identity map. It's a single source of truth. It's in a service. So it's just detached from the UI layer. And that's really the owner of the store. I mean, if you tell me the route is the owner of the store, I'm just going to look up the store in the container. If you tell me the route is the owner of the data, I'm just going to look up the store in the container and mutate it. And there you go. The route's not the owner of the data, right? So that's kind of how we think about it. The route really describes what should be loaded in the store, and the presentation layer is deciding what subset of the store should be rendered right now. And from that perspective, a component has just as much right to reach into the store and get what it needs to display, and then also send mutation requests back to it. You can think of mutations and the actions that usually change the data in the store as just being messages you're sending to the store. So that's kind of how we've thought about it for a couple of years now, and we think it's worked out really well. But I do think there needs to be a clear community-wide. One of Frank's points, which was really good, is like he was like, so when do you move an action from like a controller or route into like a component? And I was kind of like, well, whenever it makes sense. Like if I'm pulling out a component and I'm pulling along the form for the user, editing the user into that component, I'll probably pull along the actions as well. And he was like, well, when it makes sense is too general. It's too broad.
I have a nice heuristic here that I like to use, and that's I like to think about, if this thing were to change, how many files do I have to change to make that pull request? And so if my action lives in the route and I'm like 4 components deep, I've got to change that 4th component where the event is coming from, where the button click is happening, and I got to change each component that action is passing through, and then I have to change the action in the route.
Right.
So I look at that and it's like, okay, well, I just had to change 4 or 5 files to get this change in. Where if the action lives on the component, well, I change the component,
right,
and that's it.
Right.
So I look at these things as they're basically like a unit,
right,
and that unit gets changed together. And this isn't, there's sometimes like your logic changes, your business rules change, where you do have to separate these things.
Right.
So you can't know for sure, but a nice heuristic is, if I had to change this, where I should have everything that would need to change kind of living together.
Right. That's great. That's really great. Then the devil's advocate here says, well, you wouldn't have to change all 4 files if you used route action. And of course, this is actually what spurred this whole conversation, because there's an RFC to add the route action add-on to Ember. Now, the route action add-on is a dockyard add-on that they themselves have come back to and updated the README to say this is probably not a good idea. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself. It already points to some sort of fragmentation in the community around what the appropriate architecture is, and definitely points to the need for some resolution one way or the other.
Yeah, my argument against route action is I could just have a service called like my action service, and I could inject that. Route action at the end of the day is using dependency injection to inject a route everywhere. So this action, this helper can have access to it.
Right. And the question still is why you would still be changing the action on the route for like saving the user, and then the user form way down in the hierarchy. And the question is, why not have the save user action if it doesn't need to be shared, if that's the only place it's being used on the component? So,
that's interesting. It doesn't need to be shared. So when I'm thinking conceptually about components, I'm thinking about this thing, the thing that's being shared is a component. There's not just like an action that's being shared. There's a component that's being shared. And so I like the action living on the component.
Well, and then in this case, though, if this is a structural component, it's not being shared at all. Right? Because it's not being shared.
So you're talking strictly structure.
Yeah,
okay.
You're just, the only reason you made this component, again, is you start out with a big template and you're drawing a box and saying, I want to work on this functionality by itself. I don't want to have a controller with 20 actions on it.
Yeah, so then what I just said doesn't matter, but I would say the changes. Right. If I'm changing this part, if I'm changing this part of the UI, I'm changing it in this structural component. So any mutation should also be made in this structural component.
I think that's a really good heuristic, and it's like one of those universal things too. I mean, even when we were just doing Ruby and Rails and stuff, and Sandy Metz talks about making objects that change more often depend on objects that change less often, and that means exactly this, that when you make changes, you tend to see things grouped together. If you have those different levels of changes in different ways, then you're going to be changing lots of different files in different parts of the system that aren't related. So that's a great heuristic. So yeah, I'll be interested to see kind of where that RFC goes. Tom had some really good thoughts to that he chimed in with, talking about how the perspective of the core team, basically what is the model hook for, and he said it really succinctly. He said that it's to get the minimum amount of data that's needed to meaningfully render the route. And that lines in with a lot of the declarative data fetching stuff we've talked about over the last year or two. So I was really happy to see that.
That's pretty validating for us, because I think all of our routes end up being before model, after model. That's pretty much it.
Right.
We don't use any actions on the route.
Right.
So
it's just initial render. Yeah. Fetching. Yep. So yeah, why don't we talk about, we're thinking about doing some trainings again this year at EmberConf. Why don't we talk about them?
Yeah. So we've done 2 trainings the last 2 years. So 4 total.
Right.
Going into this year, I feel like we know exactly what to expect, exactly what to do.
Because that's always how it happens. We always plan it out so that we work on it half an hour a day, that 2 months leading up to it, and then the day of the training, it's just like smooth sailing. We practice it like a million times, or we pull an all-nighter,
Well, it is funny. We do a lot of prep, but the general ideas from our training are generally stuff we've been working on all year.
Yeah,
and that we're like, oh yes, we can't wait to teach this stuff.
Yes.
So
we also usually have other things going on during EmberConf, like maybe making videos for the keynote and stuff like that. So it's always busy. It's a fun time though. No, we had really good feedback on our trainings last year. The Tailwind one, we had some folks say it was like one of their favorite trainings I've ever taken. It was really cool to hear that. So yeah, originally we were thinking about redoing maybe the Tailwind one, because we think Tailwind is still one of our favorite technologies. It's still how we style our apps. Mirage would still hold up as well. What were the first 2 we did? The first year we did a components training.
We did acceptance testing.
And
components. Yep.
Acceptance testing would be a good refresher, but there's a lot of testing material out there in Ember. So this year we're thinking about doing animations and data fetching, declarative data fetching with Ember Data and Storefront.
Yeah.
So why don't we talk about the data fetching one first?
Yeah. So I feel like every year, every 12 months, like we get up on a hill that we're willing to die on.
Right.
And definitely 2018 was a Storefront hill.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. So we like being able to declare a template. This is what this template looks like. And we're not going to figure out how you go from one state to the next. That's Ember's job. So if is error, show this block of code, else show this other block of code. Like we never want to think about like, how do you hide that if? How do you show that if? We just know that when like that Boolean flips, Ember's going to take care of that. As long as we declare the HTML, then we have like a guarantee from Ember that our template's always going to be correct. Those 2 things are never going to be showing at the same time.
Right.
If there is an error, no matter how that error happens,
right.
if is error gets set to true, whether it's from a query param or this .set, that thing updates, that if statement updates.
This just came up in your forum series as well, but it's like going back to when we used to write jQuery stuff, and you're like slide up, and then you click on it, slide down, and you're like, oh wait, what if it's already down and I click on it and it doesn't slide up? And so this is the whole
you
thing.
have to think about what state am I in?
Yes.
How do I get to the next state? But the beauty of client-side apps, Ember declarative rendering is like just gets a punt on all this.
Right.
And there's like a super clear boundary. Like this is what the framework's responsible for. This is
right.
what I'm responsible for.
Right. What are the states of your application? List them out, and I'll take care of transitioning all of those states.
Yeah. And so we feel the same way with data loading. And so it's kind of back to what you were saying that Tom was saying about the route.
Mm-hmm.
Is we feel that you should be able to declare like, I need this data to render this component. I need this data to render this route.
Mm-hmm.
And you should be able to delegate that data fetching to the system.
Right.
You shouldn't have to say like, oh, if I've like half loaded this thing, load the other half. If I've loaded like some of these, Like just wait till you load the rest of them. Like that's too much
Ideally,
knowledge.
you shouldn't even have to say, if it's been a while, refresh this. You should be able to declare that somehow. You shouldn't have to account for that state. It should all be contained in the declaration of what the query is that's needed.
Right, yes. So if I'm looking at a blog post, I can say like, okay, you don't need to refetch this unless it's been more than a week.
Right.
And if it's like a really old blog post, you don't need to ever refresh it because old blog posts never change.
Right.
So yes.
So yeah, so it's interesting because there's like some smells. Like, do you use reload true ever?
Yes.
Like that should, if you think through the logical conclusion of this, that API should be removed from Ember data,
because you're telling the system what to do, not what you need.
Right. And of course, like we use reload true.
Yeah, I mean, of course.
But there is a logical conclusion here where the expressiveness, the semantics are rich enough that you can truly declare everything, and the tooling can take care of, oh, you need this query, post include comments to display this page. I know if you've loaded it. I know if I need to refresh it. I know what you have in the cache and what you don't. I can be intelligent about all that stuff, and the programmers don't have to.
This morning I was working on like the description and marketing materials for this training. And so one of the items there is like, have you ever thrown your hands up in the air and just not know what to do and then add reload true?
Yeah.
So that's, yeah. But
have you ever forced, or like even words like location dot
reload,
window dot reload or whatever?
Yeah.
Hey, we've all been there.
But there's other symptoms of this that we've noticed is like your templates load data and then flash with new data like after you render the template. So you render a template, then some data fetches, and then new data pops in. Or like this happens all the time, like especially before I had Storefront. I would like get to a component that was just like way deep in the tree. And I'm just like, yeah, I don't actually know what data's loaded.
Right.
Like I think like I know if you like came through this route,
right,
and you came through the home page and you came through this page and you did this, the data should be there. But like I don't know what happens if like you just click reload, or like you're on some other page and you somehow hit the back button and end up here.
Well, we ran into this on one of our client apps, which is why we added assert must preload as a component, because we just had components that were deep down and we're like, I don't know how this thing can be rendered. It's reused in multiple places, so it's a reusable component, which is part of the problem because originally it was made through a very specific path and now it's not. How can I just give me some feedback that this thing is only going to render once a user and all their posts are loaded, and otherwise at least give me some feedback.
Yeah. So there's like two great things here. It's like one, declaring like when I'm in this component, I don't really care how I got here.
Right.
This is the data I need. Much like when I'm writing an if statement, I don't really care how is error got set to true. I don't care if it was a query param. I don't care if it was a set. Just make this template show.
Right.
And so there's that. And then also having these tools like assert must preload. So for you as a programmer can get these like guarantees. It's basically like strategies for declaring that the right data is loaded.
Right. Yep.
And so this is something that this has been like so much of our conversations over the last year.
Yes. It's exciting.
Yeah.
It's like this stuff really is exciting because also like we talk about Storefront because it's just our add-on place to experiment with things. But all this stuff is in the spirit of what Ember Data already does. It's just like the rationalized conclusion of it. Like store.findAll is great, and then you want to start including things, and that's where you can get in a situation where I called findAll, but then I called findAll with include over here. And so I actually would want to block if that's never been called with include, but even though it's called without it. And so now we have two new states in our app. So that's the kind of thing that's like, oh, really, if you think about it now that, and again, this is not a knock on Ember Data. It's just that now we understand this stuff so much better, having used JSON API and having the client be a querier that's actually issuing queries to the back end. Now you want to be able to say, have I issued that query? And this is like back in the day, at TED, we were doing like has fully loaded.
Has fully loaded, and like, my favorite model
yeah,
attribute.
Yeah, exactly. So from the training perspective, it's not about everyone should use Storefront. It's more like to be aware, make sure your thinking is correct on this stuff. And then when you do come into this, like there's ways to solve it without Storefront. Storefront's our best way to just share our solutions. And ultimately, eventually, we would hope that some of those ideas can make their way back into Ember Data.
Yep. Yeah, and like you said, like we're not knocking on Ember Data. Ember Data has has to be flexible.
It's getting us to the 80th floor. We're
Yeah.
just going a little bit further.
Well, it just has to be like super flexible. It has to do all these different use cases, and then it tries to help you out where if you do like each model dot relationship and that thing isn't loaded,
Right.
it's going to go figure out how to load that.
Right.
It's trying to be helpful, and it's one of those things when it works, it's amazing.
Right.
But there's all these as your app grows and gets complex, and you have more states and more transitions from state A to state C to it creates a lot more the surface area for these types of bugs really shows up.
Right.
So
right. And real quickly, we can just chat about animations. This is something we've been itching to dive into, both for some EmberMap series, get some animations on our site, and now being able to teach it at EmberConf is going to be great because all those things are just going to, really push us to get all of the ideas we have around this kind of buttoned up. So, Ed Faulkner announced Ember Animated this year at EmberConf in March of 2018. And he's been doing a lot of work on that. And if you go to the site, it's like this is still in progress. But if you talk to him, he's like, it's all there. It just needs to be exposed and surfaced and documented and demoed and stuff. So we're hoping that we can, use the training and this stuff to help with that side of it. And it'll be really interesting. We'll talk about Liquid Fire. It's a similar story, right? Where Liquid Fire provided some high level stuff, but then once you realize, instead of like post.comments triggering an AJAX request, what we really need is like a query aware fetching thing. And it's the same idea where like Liquid Fire was able to do some of the things, but then the things it wasn't, it was like, it's actually because we're just one level too high. So we need a primitive one level lower. And that's what like the animated each is, animated bind and animate each that come with Ember Animated. And so we're going to talk about animated each, and we're going to show kind of everything you can do with it. We're going to talk about declarative animations. A lot of the same lessons from declarative rendering and declarative data fetching are there.
I mean, that's huge.
Yes.
Again, not describing how to animate from A to B, just saying that when this thing changes, animations happen.
Actually, you do describe the animation from A to B, you just do it separately. It's like, that's actually what you care about now, right? When an animation, you actually are saying like, when I go from A to B, this is what I want to do. Or really a more general way to say it is, anytime I'm coming to B, here's what the rule is. And no matter I'm coming from A or C or D, here's what we do. And you can do that with Ember Animated. So like the momentum keeps up, because think about all those states if you actually had to do it. So you can define some constraints and some rules for it's almost like keyframe. It's almost like keyframing if you ever done that in like a video editor tool or an animation tool on a computer where
I'm thinking of like Keynote.
Yeah, exactly. Like Magic Move style. Like Magic Move, you say here, and then you define some rules for like tweening and acceleration, and that way the tooling can take care of that stuff. But you can imagine the two slides that are next to each other are the declaration of the two states.
Right. So if I'm moving text across the screen, I'm never describing how to move that text. I'm just saying it should start here and end up here.
Well, you're saying the text is here on the home page and here on the next route, and then you're defining an animation that says. So the reason I know this is because in D3 you kind of do something similar where you say the way you would do it is like you define the end state. So let's say on EmberMap's homepage you have a bookshelf and we have like 8 videos, and then you click on it and you want to animate up. So the 2 templates are actually defining your beginning and end state. So that's what you're talking about. Whereas like if you had a state machine of all the states in the app, that would be that.
Yes.
But then you want to animate it, so you have to add a rule that says, when I'm going to this, I want to take 500 milliseconds. So I'm going to have this thing identified by some key, my poster of my video. And it's going to go from wherever it's going to go from, it's going to end up here. How do you get there? You take 500 milliseconds, you use an easing, you have the starting position. And then you get to define the animation, which is saying the starting position, take 500 milliseconds, move in this easing curve function, or use this physics spring motion. And so you actually are defining the state transition, but you're doing it in a way
these two things are separate.
Yeah, exactly.
I see.
Yes. And you can do it in a general enough way that it works no matter what. And this is like the demo he showed where like, so you have on the homepage right here, it's locked in, you know exactly where it is. Click on it and it goes to here. But what if you go here and then you're halfway and you hit the back button again, you want it to go back? You're not going to define that state anywhere. It's just, that's the starting state for the animation that you get in that function. and you know the end state based on the template. So you're always kind of interpolating between those two things.
Nice.
Super cool.
Yes.
And just that he built that and is aware, and like talking about, CSS animations, you can do a lot of stuff with that, but Ember's not aware of that. So if Ember's involved with asynchronous things like transitioning a route, your CSS animations, it's not going to know that. It's not going to respect that, right? So that's another big benefit of using something like Ember Animated. But we want to make it really practical and make it really clear how, you should leave this and feel like if you want to add that across route animated transition for your app, you should be able to do that after this training.
Yeah, I'm thinking for this one, it's really exercise heavy.
Yeah.
Like a bunch of examples of an Ember app without these animations.
Yes.
and thinking about, okay, how can we do this? When would you use this animation over that animation?
Yep.
So yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Very excited for this.
Yeah, me too. All right. Well, it's December 12th and I'm going to be in Florida next week. I'm not going to be walking around 25 degree New York City. And then I will be in Minnesota the following week, walking around in negative 13 degree Minnesota.
So you're gonna make up for it.
Yeah, exactly. The average temperature will be about 30 degrees over my Christmas break. But this might be, maybe we'll do, I guess if we did another podcast, we do it on Monday next week, but we'll see. This might be the last one for 2018. So if we don't see you next week, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Hanukkah. Hope you all have good end of your year, and yeah, we'll see you in 2019.
Nice.
All right. See ya.
See ya.